The first time any of us in Prairie Ridge County laid eyes on Roger Sterling's new tractor, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. It was the spring of 1976. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and diesel smoke, the familiar scent of planting season. I was out on my northernmost 80, wrestling with the four-bottom John Deere plow behind my old 4020. The diesel engine was barking a steady, reliable rhythm, a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the familiar chatter of a two-cylinder popping Johnny or the throaty growl of an international harvester. This was different. It was a deep, earth-shaking rumble that vibrated up through the soles of my work boots. I killed the throttle on the 4020, and the sudden quiet was filled by this approaching thunder. I stood up on the operator's platform, wiping grease from my hands onto an already stained rag, and looked west toward the county road. Cresting the hill was a monster. It was a big Bud 747, or one of its kin, a behemoth of articulated steel, painted a garish industrial white. It was pulling a cultivator that looked wide enough to till half the county in a single pass. The dual tires on each of its four corners were taller than I was, churning up gravel on the road shoulder as it made the turn onto Roger's land, the section that bordered mine. The sheer scale of it was obscene, an affront to the landscape. It didn't belong here among the rolling hills and modest family farms. It belonged on the vast, flat plains of Montana or the Dakotas. Behind the wheel, encased in a glass cab the size of a small fishing shanty, sat Roger Sterling. He'd bought the old Henderson place 2 years prior, coming in with a flood of bank money and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He didn't farm like us, he didn't nurture the land, he conquered it. He tore out 100-year-old fence rows, filled in waterways, and farmed with a brutal efficiency that left the soil gasping. My 4020, which had always felt like a king on this land, suddenly looked like a toy. It was a 1968 model, the last tractor my father and I had bought together. Its green paint was faded and chipped, showing primer and even bare metal in spots. A spiderweb of cracks marked the rear fender where a log had rolled against it a decade ago. But that tractor was mine. Every nut, every bolt, every gallon of high-guard fluid in its transmission was paid for. The farm itself, 320 acres of the best black dirt in the state, had been in my family since the Homestead Act. It was ours, free and clear. No banker held a note on it. That was a legacy my father had left me, more valuable than gold. Never bet the land, son. Never. The big Bud finished its turn and settled into the field, the massive Cummins engine bellowing as the cultivator shanks bit into the earth. It moved at a speed that defied its size, a great white shark swimming through a sea of black soil. I watched for a minute, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't farming. It was an invasion. Later that afternoon, I was at the co-op, filling a 55-gallon drum with 15W40 oil. Roger pulled up in his brand-new Ford F-250, the one with the Ranger trim package and two-tone paint. He swaggered over, smelling of fresh coffee and ambition. "See the new horse, Silas?" he asked, grinning. He didn't wait for an answer. "She'll do 80 acres an hour without breaking a sweat. Got a stereo and air conditioning in the cab. It's the future." I finished cranking the pump and wiped my hands. "What's a thing like that cost, Roger?" He laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "If you have to ask, you can't afford it. Let's just say the boys down at Merchants National are my new best friends." He glanced over at my '65 Chevy C50 grain truck, its faded red paint and wooden stake sides looking ancient next to his gleaming Ford. "You're still messing with that old iron. A man can't feed the world with museum pieces." I looked him square in the eye. My hands were calloused and stained with grease that would never fully wash out. His were soft, like a banker's. "Maybe so," I said, my voice low and even, "but I've found a man can't feed his own family if the bank owns his world." Roger's smile faltered for a second. He just shook his head, clapped me on the shoulder in a way that was more of a shove, and walked into the office to sign another ticket, adding to a tab that must have been a mile long. I stood there, the smell of diesel and oil hanging in the air, watching him go. He was the future, they all said. He was progress. I was just a stubborn fool, clinging to the past. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks, Have you ever known a man like Roger? Someone who believed that the newest, biggest, and most expensive thing was always the best way? Or have you known a man like me who put his trust in the old ways, in the tried and true iron that he could fix with his own two hands? Let me know down in the comments which one of those men you'd put your money on to survive what was coming. Because a storm was brewing, bigger than any of us could have imagined, and it was about to wash over the heartland. The spring of '77 was wet, the kind of relentless, soul-soaking rain that turns fields into swamps and farm lanes into impassable quagmires. It was a race against the calendar, trying to get the corn in the ground during the few dry days we were given. I was pushing the 40-20 hard, pulling a 6-row John Deere 7000 planter, working from sunup until well after sundown. The duels left deep ruts in the soggy ground, but I had no choice. One evening, with only about 40 acres left to plant, it happened. I was on a hillside, the engine lugging hard, when I heard a sharp crack like a rifle shot, followed by a sickening metallic grinding. The engine seized instantly, the rear wheels locked up, and the tractor slid to a dead stop. A plume of white smoke, thick and oily, billowed from the breather tube. I knew what it was before I even shut off the key. I had thrown a rod. I sat there for a long moment in the deafening silence, the smell of burnt oil filling the cab. The moon was rising, casting a pale, cold light over the field. My heart sank. This wasn't just a breakdown, it was a catastrophe. A new engine block, if I could even find one, would cost thousands. Money I didn't have. The local Deere dealership would charge a fortune for the labor, and they were backed up for weeks. My planting window was slamming shut. The next morning, I walked the 2 miles back to the farmstead and got my tools. I spent the rest of the day in the mud, draining the oil, a silver metallic slurry, and dropping the oil pan. My worst fears were confirmed. The number 4 connecting rod had snapped. It had punched a grapefruit-sized hole in the side of the engine block and turned the crankshaft journal into a chewed-up piece of scrap metal. The engine was toast. While I was lying on my back in the mud, covered in grease and despair, Roger Sterling drove by on the field lane in his pickup. He slowed down, rolled down his power window, and looked at the dead 40-20 on the hill. He didn't say a word, he just shook his head with a little smirk and drove on. That look said more than any words could. It said, "I told you so. That's what you get for trusting old junk." The talk started at the grain elevator and spread to the diner. Silas Blackwood's 40-20 finally gave up the ghost. Heard he blew it up good. Serves him right for not trading it in. How's he going to get his crop in now? Too proud to ask for help. They were right about one thing. I was too proud. I wasn't going to go cap in hand to the bank for a loan on a new tractor I couldn't afford. And I wasn't going to ask my neighbors who were all stretched thin themselves. There was only one way. I had to fix it myself. I spent the next 2 days pulling that engine. Using my Farmall M with a loader and a heavy chain, I hoisted the 600-pound cylinder head off, then the block itself. I hauled the greasy, broken heart of my tractor back to the workshop, a place that smelled of damp concrete, welding rods, and decades of hard work. Finding a used block for a 40-20 diesel in those days was next to impossible. I spent hours on the phone calling every salvage yard from Des Moines to Omaha. Nothing. Finally, a grizzled old-timer in a scrapyard up in Minnesota said he had one, but it was from a burned tractor. "Casting's probably fine," he grunted over the line, "but you'll have to get it checked. $500 and you haul it." I drove all night in my old Chevy truck, a 14-hour round trip. The block was sitting in a field of weeds, scorched black and ugly. I paid the man in cash, loaded it with a chain hoist, and drove home, exhausted but with a glimmer of hope. The next week was a blur of meticulous, painstaking labor. I took the block and my old crankshaft to a machine shop in the city. They magnafluxed the block to check for cracks. It was sound. They turned the crank, welding up the damaged journal and grinding it back to 10,000ths undersize. While that was being done, I sat in my shop, cleaning every single part. I soaked the pistons in diesel fuel, scraping the carbon from the ring grooves with a broken piece of piston ring. I lapped the valves by hand, using grinding compound and a suction cup on a stick, rotating it back and forth between my palms until the mating surfaces were perfect. I cleaned every bolt, every nut, every pushrod, laying them out on a clean bench in the exact order they came off. It was slow, greasy, frustrating work. I had to order a new rod, a set of bearings, and a complete gasket kit. The parts weren't cheap. I paid for them with the money I had set aside to replace the roof on the barn. The barn could wait. The corn couldn't. While I toiled, the world moved on. The sun shone, the ground dried, and my neighbors finished their planting. Roger Sterling's big bud had his 1,000 acres planted in 3 days. Every time I heard its distant rumble, my stomach twisted into another knot. I was falling behind, a man out of time. My only other tractor big enough to pull the planter was the old Farmall M, my grandfather's tractor. It was reliable, but it was a 1949 model with about 40 horsepower. It would be like trying to plow with a garden tiller. But it was all I had. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of non-stop work, the rebuilt engine was ready to go back in. I had torqued the head bolts in the proper sequence, set the valve lash with a feeler gauge, and primed the oil pump. My brother-in-law Dale came over to help me wrestle the engine back onto the frame rails. We bled the fuel injectors, one by one, until clear, bubble-free diesel sprayed out. I climbed into the seat, my hands trembling slightly from exhaustion and nerves. I turned the key. The starter motor groaned, turning the fresh, tight engine over slowly. Once, twice. On the third rotation, it coughed. A puff of white smoke erupted from the exhaust stack, followed by a cloud of black. And then it caught. The 4020 roared back to life, settling into a smooth, powerful idle that was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I had done it. I had cheated the boneyard. But I had lost 13 days. The corn went in late, and the whole county knew it. I finished planting under a hot, late May sun, the soil already getting dry and hard. It would be a struggle for that crop to catch up. I had saved my farm from the bankers, but I had put my entire year's harvest in jeopardy. And as I watched the first tender green shoots struggle to break through the crusty soil, I couldn't help but wonder if the gossips in town were right. Maybe I was just a stubborn old fool. The late 70s were a strange time to be a farmer. After I got my 4020 running, the season turned out better than I had any right to expect. We got timely rains in July and August, and that late-planted corn surprised everyone, myself included. It wasn't a bin-buster, but it was a solid crop. And the prices, my lord, the prices. It had started earlier in the decade with the big grain sales to the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the demand for American corn and soybeans exploded. The government was telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Land values, which had been stable for a generation, started to climb, then they shot skyward like a rocket. A piece of ground that sold for $500 an acre in 1970 was going for $2,000, then $3,000 by '78. It was a gold rush, and the air in the heartland was thick with the promise of unimaginable wealth. For men like Roger Sterling, it was the vindication of everything they believed in. With his massive equipment, he could farm more acres than any 3 of the rest of us combined. He was making money so fast, he probably had to hire someone to count it. The high grain prices easily covered the massive payments on his machinery and the interest on his land loans. And the banks, they couldn't get enough of him. Every time land came up for sale, Roger was there, backed by the Merchants National Bank. He bought the old Miller place, a prime 160 acres that bordered my southern fence line. Then he picked up the widow Jensen's 80 when she moved to town. His empire was growing, and with every new purchase, his legend grew too. He traded in his year-old Big Bud for a newer, more powerful Steiger Tiger. He bought 2 brand-new International 1486 combines with 8-row corn heads. He put up massive grain bins, the gleaming silver kind with electric augers, making my old wooden cribs look like relics from the Stone Age. He bought a new Peterbilt semi-truck so he wouldn't have to wait in line at the elevator. His farmstead, which used to be a modest collection of old barns, was now a sprawling complex of new machine sheds and steel buildings. He was the king of Prairie Ridge County. I saw him at the diner one morning. He was holding court in a corner booth, surrounded by other younger farmers and the local bank president. They were all laughing, drawing on napkins, talking about expansion and land prices. He saw me come in and waved me over. A big, magnanimous gesture. "Silas, come on, have a cup of coffee on me," he boomed. "We're celebrating. Just closed on the old Schmidt Quarter." I just nodded and sat at the counter. "Congratulations, Roger." "You ought to get in on this, Silas," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That farm of yours, free and clear, the bank would loan you $1 million against it tomorrow. $1 million. You could buy a whole new line of equipment, pick up another section of land. You're sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a garden patch." The bank president nodded in agreement. "He's right, Silas. Your equity is incredible. We could set you up with a line of credit that would make your head spin. It's the modern way of doing business." I just stirred my coffee. "My father had a saying," I said quietly, to no one in particular. He said, "The bank is a great partner in the good times, but they're the only partner who's guaranteed to get paid in the bad times." Roger and his friends had a good laugh at that. "You and your father's sayings," he said, shaking his head. "This isn't the Depression, old man. These prices are here to stay. The whole world wants our grain. We're just getting started." I paid for my coffee and left. The laughter followed me out the door. To them, I was a failure, a man who lacked vision and courage. I was a relic, a stubborn fool who was letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass him by. I can't say it didn't get to me. When you see your neighbors driving new pickups and taking vacations to Florida while you're patching a tire on a 30-year-old grain wagon, you start to question yourself. My wife, Sarah, saw it. She never said a word, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The profits I made from those high grain prices didn't go toward a new tractor or a bigger farm. They went into the farm itself. I paid cash to have the house re-shingled. I finally built that new machine shed I'd been dreaming of, a good 40 by 60 pole building. I paid for the steel and the lumber with a check, not a loan. It felt good. It felt solid. After a couple of good years, I did buy another tractor. I found a used International 966 with low hours over in the next county. It was a good, strong tractor, and I paid cash for it. It sat in my new shed next to the 4020, both of them owned by me, not the bank. But in the eyes of the community, I was falling further and further behind. I was the cautionary tale they told their sons. Don't be like Silas Blackwood. He was too scared to take a risk, and he missed the boat. As the decade wound to a close, however, I started noticing things. Small things at first. A headline in the Wall Street Journal I'd see when I was waiting for parts at the dealership. It talked about something called inflation. The price of everything was going up. Fuel, fertilizer, seed, parts. My operating costs were climbing steadily. At the co-op, I overheard the manager on the phone arguing with the supplier. "What do you mean the price went up again? I just ordered this 2 weeks ago." Then one afternoon, I stopped in at the bank to deposit a check. My friend Tom, a loan officer who'd been there for 30 years, called me into his office. He looked tired. "Silas," he said, lowering his voice, "I'm not supposed to say anything, but you're a friend. Things are changing." "What do you mean?" I asked. He pushed a sheet of paper across his desk. It was an internal memo from their corporate headquarters. "The Fed is trying to get this inflation under control," he said. "They're jacking up interest rates. The prime rate went up another 0.5 point this morning." "What's it at now?" I asked. Tom took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "It's at 12%, he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And they're saying it's going to go higher, a lot higher." I felt a chill go down my spine that had nothing to do with the bank's air conditioning. 12%. When my father took out his last operating loan in the 60s, he paid 4%. "What's that going to do to guys like Roger Sterling?" I asked. "He's borrowed millions." Tom just looked at me, his face grim. "Most of his loans are on a variable rate, tied to the prime. Every time the rate goes up, his payments go up." He leaned forward. "Silas, I've never seen anything like this. It's like the whole world has gone crazy with debt, and the piper is about to come calling." I walked out of that bank, into the bright summer sunshine, but everything looked different. A dark cloud had appeared on the horizon, a cloud that only a few of us could see. The party was still going strong, the music was still playing, but I could hear the first faint rumblings of a terrible thunder. And I knew deep in my bones that a storm was coming to wash us all away. The summer of 1979 came in hot and stayed that way. The sky turned a pale, hazy blue and forgot how to make clouds. The corn, which had shot up tall and green in June, began to show the strain. The bottom leaves started to fire, turning a sickly yellow-brown, and by midday the upper leaves would roll up tight as cigars to protect themselves from the relentless sun. The cracks in the black dirt grew wide enough to lose a wrench in. You could feel the anxiety simmering in the air, as thick as the heat itself. Every conversation at the co-op started with the weather and ended with a worried glance at the sky. For me, the drought meant long hours. I cultivated my corn with the old Farmall M, trying to break up the crust and conserve what little moisture was left. It was slow, tedious work, but it was cheap. The M sipped gasoline, and I could fix anything on it with the tools in my own shop. My newer 966 and the rebuilt 4020 sat in the shed, saved for the heavy work of fall harvest. For Roger Sterling, the drought meant pushing his machinery harder than ever. I'd see his massive Steiger Tiger running late into the night, its bank of halogen lights cutting a swath across the landscape. He was pulling a huge anhydrous ammonia applicator, side-dressing his corn, trying to force-feed it into growing despite the lack of rain. The roar of that big Cummins or Caterpillar engine was a constant presence on the horizon, a sound of desperate, expensive hope. One afternoon in early August, the sound stopped. It was so abrupt it was jarring. The silence that rushed in felt unnatural. I was on my southern fence line, stretching new barbed wire, and I looked over toward Roger's field. The Steiger was sitting motionless in the middle of a row, the applicator knives still buried in the dry earth. A few minutes later, I saw Roger get out of the cab, walk around the rear of the tractor, and kick one of the giant tires with all his might. Even from a quarter-mile away, I could feel the rage and frustration in that gesture. He spent the rest of the afternoon out there. I saw his pickup drive out, then a service truck from the big dealership in the city an hour away. They had it hooked up to diagnostic equipment I'd never seen before. They huddled around the rear axle housing, shaking their heads. By dusk, they gave up. The next morning, a lowboy trailer arrived to haul the crippled giant away. I ran into one of the dealership mechanics at the parts counter a few days later. "What happened to Sterling's Steiger?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. He rolled his eyes and wiped grease from his hands with a blue shop towel. "Catastrophic failure in the outboard planetary final drive," he said, like he was reciting from a manual. "Took out the whole axle shaft and the ring gear. He must have been pulling it to hell and back in that hard ground." He leaned in closer. "You didn't hear it from me, but the parts alone are pushing $15,000. And that's if we can even get 'em. They're back-ordered for 6 weeks. Labor's going to be another $5,000 on top of that." He whistled softly. $20,000, just to get it to move again. $20,000. That was more than I'd paid for my last 3 tractors combined. Roger was without his main horse for the rest of the summer. The corn suffered, but the real cracks in his empire were starting to show in other ways. The price of diesel fuel seemed to jump every week. The news on the radio was all about hostages in Iran and a man named Ayatollah. It felt a world away, but it had a direct line to the pump at the co-op. Roger's 2 big combines and his semi-truck drank diesel like it was water. I heard he had to prepay for his full fuel delivery, a massive bill that made the co-op manager's eyes water. Then the letters from the bank started coming. Not for me, but I saw the look on the faces of the men who were getting them. Tom, my banker friend, looked older every time I saw him. The prime interest rate, the one he'd warned me about, had been climbing steadily. It was no longer 12%. It was 14, then 15, then 16. Every time Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve raised the rate to fight inflation, a wave of panic washed over the countryside. Men like Roger, who had borrowed millions on variable rate notes, were being crushed. Their interest payments were doubling, then tripling, while their crops withered in the fields. The old arrogance was gone from Roger's face. I saw him at the elevator that fall, waiting in line behind a dozen other farmers. His harvest was disappointing, the corn light and chaffy from the drought. His new Peterbilt was gone, replaced by a pair of older, smaller tandem-axle trucks he'd hired. He looked thin, worried. The confident swagger was replaced by a nervous energy, his eyes constantly darting around as if looking for an escape. He nodded at me, a quick, jerky motion, but he didn't speak. The king of Prairie Ridge County looked like a man who was hearing footsteps behind him, and they were getting closer. The storm I had sensed was no longer on the horizon. The first cold drops of rain had begun to fall. The year 1980 was the year the bottom fell out. On a cold day in January, President Carter announced an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union to protest their invasion of Afghanistan. It was meant to be a political statement, a shot across the bow of the Kremlin. But here in the heartland, it was a bullet to the head. The market opened the next morning in absolute chaos. The price of corn, which had been holding precariously above $3 a bushel, collapsed. It dropped 50 cents in a single day. By the end of the week, it was struggling to stay above $2.50. All that grain sitting in those massive gleaming bins on Roger Sterling's farm, the grain he was holding as collateral against his loans, had just lost nearly a quarter of its value overnight. The embargo was the first domino. The second was the interest rates. They didn't stop at 16%. By spring, the prime rate hit an unimaginable 18%. Then 20%. The words 21.5% prime were spoken on the evening news, a death sentence delivered by a calm, dispassionate anchor in a suit 1,000 miles away. The banks, squeezed by the Fed, had no choice but to pass those rates on. Variable rate operating loans, machinery notes, and mortgages all reset to the new astronomical numbers. It was a perfect storm. Income was slashed by collapsing commodity prices, while expenses exploded because of hyperinflation and crippling interest rates. The gold rush was over. The land that had been a farmer's greatest asset was now an anchor, dragging him down into a sea of debt. Land values, which had seemed unstoppable, suddenly stalled, then began to fall. A farm that was worth $3,000 an acre in 1979 was worth maybe $2,000 in 1981. And the price was still dropping. Farmers who had borrowed heavily against their equity suddenly found themselves upside down, owing more to the bank than their entire farm was worth. The mood in the county turned funereal. The laughter in the diner was replaced by hushed, desperate conversations. Good men, honest men who had worked hard their entire lives were being broken. You'd see foreclosure notices tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse, a stark white list of familiar names. The auction bills started appearing on telephone poles, black and white flyers announcing the end of a family's dream, sometimes a dream that had lasted for generations. Roger Sterling held on longer than most. He was a fighter. He sold off one of his new combines. He sold the Steiger Tiger as soon as it was repaired, taking a huge loss. He tried to farm his 2,000 acres with older, less reliable equipment he picked up at auction. But it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. His payments to the bank were astronomical. The interest alone was more than most of us made in a year. I stayed out of it. I kept my head down and did my work. My farm was safe. With no debt, the interest rates were just a number on the news. My input costs were low. I burned less fuel, my repairs were cheaper, and I didn't have a single payment to make to anyone. When corn was $2 a bushel, I wasn't getting rich, but I wasn't going broke either. I was surviving. And in the farm crisis of the 1980s, survival was victory. My neighbors, the ones who had quietly pitied me or openly mocked me just a few years before, started stopping by the shop. They'd come under the pretense of borrowing a tool or asking about a part, but what they really wanted was to talk. They'd stand there, turning a wrench over in their hands, and tell me about the letters from the bank, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing everything their fathers and grandfathers had built. I listened. I didn't say, "I told you so." There was no satisfaction in being right when it cost so many people so much. I just listened, and when they were done, I'd say, "Let's have a cup of coffee." The final notice for Roger Sterling came in the spring of 1982. The auction was set for a Saturday in early April. The flyer was everywhere, listing it all in cold, hard type. 2,040 acres, to be offered in 5 separate parcels. A full line of farm machinery, household goods, everything. The empire was being liquidated. The reign of the king was over. The day of Roger Sterling's auction was grey and cold, with a raw wind that cut right through your coat. It felt like the sky was mourning. The county road leading to his farm was lined with pickups for a mile in both directions. It seemed the whole world had come to watch a man's life be dismantled, piece by piece. I parked my truck and walked up the long lane. The farmstead, once a symbol of progress and prosperity, was now a scene of orderly chaos. The machinery was lined up in neat rows in the hayfield, each piece tagged with a number. The Steiger was gone, but the rest was there. The big international combines, the massive planters and tillage equipment, the grain trucks. They looked like dinosaurs in a museum, relics of an extinct era of optimism. The crowd was a strange mix. There were somber-faced neighbors, there to offer silent support or perhaps to pick up a bargain. There were bargain hunters from 2 states away, vultures circling a kill, and there were the bankers, standing in a small, tight group, their city shoes looking out of place in the muddy farmyard, their faces impassive. Roger was standing by the machine shed, his wife and 2 young children beside him. He wore a clean flannel shirt and jeans, but he looked like a ghost. His eyes were hollow, and he had lost so much weight his clothes seemed to hang on him. He wasn't the swaggering titan I had known. He was just a broken man, watching his world being sold to the highest bidder. Our eyes met across the yard. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked away, a flicker of shame and regret crossing his face. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools and shop equipment. His rhythmic chant, a sound I usually found exciting, felt like a funeral dirge. I didn't bid on any of it. I was waiting. The land was what mattered. They sold the home place first, the 80 acres with the house and all the new buildings. It went to an out-of-state insurance company, a cold corporate entity that would tear down the house and farm it with hired men. Then they moved on to the other parcels. The bidding was slow, sluggish. The land market was dead. No one had the money or the nerve to buy. The parcels were selling for less than half of what Roger had paid for them just a few years earlier. With every rap of the gavel, the bankers standing nearby made another note on their clipboards, their expressions grim. Even they were losing money today. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel. "All right, folks, next up we have the old Miller place, a prime 160-acre tract of Class 1 soil right here on the south side." That was the land that bordered my own. I knew every swale and rise of it. My father had always said it was some of the best ground in the county. I felt a knot in my gut. I hadn't come here to buy land. I had come to bear witness, but I couldn't stand the thought of some faceless corporation owning the field right next to mine. The bidding started low, $1,000 an acre. It crept up slowly, $1,100, $1,200. It stalled at $1,250. The auctioneer worked the crowd, his voice pleading. "Folks, you're not going to find ground like this again. Who'll give 13? Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. I looked at Roger. He was staring at that piece of ground, the first piece he had bought after his home place, the real start of his expansion. I took a deep breath. 1,300, I said. My voice was louder than I intended. Every head turned to look at me. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got 13 from Silas Blackwood. Now who'll give 1350? The man from the insurance company raised a finger. 1350. I didn't hesitate. 14. He came back with 1450. I said 1,500. I knew exactly how much cash I had in my accounts. I knew my limit. This was it. The corporate man conferred with his partner. He shook his head. The auctioneer looked at me, then back at him. "Sold," he cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air. "For $1,500 an acre to Silas Blackwood." A quiet murmur went through the crowd. I had just spent $250,000. It was more money than my father had seen in his entire lifetime. But it was my money, not the bank's. I walked over to the clerk's table and wrote the check. When I was done, I walked over to Roger. He was standing alone now, his family having gone back toward the house. "Silas," he said, his voice rough. He wouldn't look at me. "You didn't have to do that." "It's good land, Roger," I said quietly. "It deserves to be farmed by someone who lives on it." He finally looked up, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I was a fool," he whispered. "I thought I was so smart. The big machinery, the new buildings. I had it all. And it was all built on sand. You weren't a fool," I said, and I meant it. "You just believed the gospel they were preaching. A lot of good men did. I stuck out my hand, the one with the calluses and the grease-stained fingernails. If you need some work to get back on your feet, I could use a hand this spring. Planting that extra 160 won't be easy. He stared at my hand for a long moment, then he took it. His grip was weak, but it was there. "Thank you, Silas," he said. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The 1980s were lean years for everyone, but we made it through. Roger took me up on my offer. He worked for me for 2 seasons, driving my old grain truck, helping me in the shop. He was a good worker, and he never complained. Eventually, he got a job managing the co-op in the next town over. He was good at it. He understood the numbers side of farming better than anyone. We remained friends, a quiet, respectful kind of friendship, born from a shared tragedy. The community changed. The farms that survived were the ones like mine, the ones with little or no debt. The wisdom of the old ways came back into fashion. Frugality and caution were virtues again. People started fixing their old machinery instead of trading it in. They talked about soil conservation and crop rotation, not just yield per acre. I never got any bigger. The 320 my father left me, plus the 160 I bought at Roger's sale, was enough. It was more than enough. I kept my old tractors running. The 4020 became a legend in the county. My son, David, learned to drive on it. He learned how to change its oil, how to set the points on the distributor of the old M, how to feel the land through the seat of his pants instead of watching it on a computer screen. Now I'm an old man. My hands are gnarled with arthritis, and my steps are slow. David runs the farm, and he runs it well. He has a new tractor, a John Deere with a quiet cab and a GPS unit that steers itself. But he paid for half of it in cash, and he made sure the payments on the rest were something he could handle even if corn prices fell through the floor. And in the back of the machine shed, under a canvas tarp, sits the 4020. Its paint is almost completely gone, but the engine is as strong as ever. Every once in a while, on a clear spring morning, David will fire it up. His own son, my grandson, will climb up on the fender beside him. Just the other day, I was watching them from the porch. David was letting the boy steer as they cultivated the garden patch. I heard my grandson ask him why he kept such an old tractor around when he had the new, fancy one. David shut the throttle down so the boy could hear him over the engine's familiar, steady rhythm. "Well, son," he said, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder, "this tractor is a reminder. Your great-grandfather taught me, and his father taught him, something very important. He said this land, this dirt we're turning over right now, is all that really matters. And you never, ever bet the land." I leaned back in my chair, the warm sun on my face, and listened to the sound of that old diesel engine echoing across the fields. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of home.